Hello everyone, this is the Lame Apologetics. Today, I'm bringing you a little something different than what you might have heard over the years dealing with the issues of Islam. You probably heard of the issues with the proposed scientific miracles, the issues with Allah's knowledge, and most likely the Islamic dilemma, considering that's very popular as of recently, and rightfully so. But what if I told you that Islam has another dilemma in their midst? I know, it seems like Islam is just full of holes as of late, and they are. However, Muslims don't seem aware of the metaphysical commitments they have to Islam when dealing with the aspects of morality. This, as I will show, will indicate incoherent moral principles within their framework and will have much more issues with their philosophical implications as well. So let's get started by introducing what I dub the moral incoherency argument against Islam. I will explain each premise in detail and exactly what these premises seek to demonstrate. P1. Islam claims that all moral truths ultimately depend on Allah. P2. Either Allah's commands determine what is morally right, or they express pre-existing moral facts grounded in Allah's nature, also as grounded in Scripture. P3. If Allah's commands determine what is right, morality becomes arbitrary. P4. If Allah's commands express pre-existing moral facts grounded in His nature, then His nature must be consistent with the moral phenomena we recognize as well as Scripture. P5. The moral content of Allah's commands, as found in Islamic scripture and practice, conflict with the moral phenomena we recognize as well as Scripture. C1. Therefore, Allah's nature cannot be the foundation of objective morality. C2. Therefore, Islam's account of morality is incoherent. Let's start with premise 1 here. Premise 1 has a nice dialectic setup to make premise 2 more potent and the argument flow much better. This premise consists of a grounding claim, which is to say that the Islamic commitments must adhere to morality being objective and dependent on Allah. Thus, moral properties of reality must be sourced to Allah, not separate from Him. This premise also creates a sort of precog into the arguments against Islam, hence the strong backing from premise 2, which introduces a core moral issues with these commitments. Premise 1 also forces the argument to engage solely with Muslims who affirm the Islamic frameworks. If they were to deny premise 1, then the issues would arise within their own affirmation of set of beliefs surrounding the Islamic framework. Islam has a set of commitments that are objective within their view, given the metaphysical commitments, so a denial of premise 1 would be a denial of Islam, making Islam false by omission of the interlocutor. Ultimately, this premise is rock solid, and Muslims will be hard-pressed to find themselves to deny the truth aptness of the propositions given. Premise 2 then follows up strongly after premise 1 to create a true dichotomy. Here we can see how premise 1 will do some serious heavy lifting to support this premise as well as the rest of the premises. Premise 2 is proposing that there exists a binary in regards to the accessibility of moral truths. As premise 1 stated, all moral truths derive from Allah under the Islamic paradigm. So, there can only be a few ways we index these moral truths to Allah, and the most logical, especially under Islam's framework, are going to be from divine revelations, i.e. commands from Allah. Since these commands are what tie our epistemology to specific moral truths, then these commands must have a set function in accordance with moral truths. The only two ways we can logically derive this is to say it's either the case that the commands themselves, the semantic utterances, are the moral truths, or that the commands are a sort of semantic tool utilized by Allah to express pre-existing moral truths that are grounded in His nature, i.e. moral truths are His nature in a sense. Considering the affirmation of premise 1, there is no real way to rebut this premise as a mere false dichotomy, because if moral truths derive from Allah, and the divine revelations by command are the key feature to know these moral truths, then there is no other way to claim these commands have more applications than the binary presented. Now, a Muslim might claim that it's a false dichotomy because Allah's commands are actually expressing His will and His nature, the expressive grounding, so there is no distinction, i.e. there are more nuanced or hybrid views. But let's stop right there. This does not necessarily add an extra value to the premise because that hybrid view can still align with the dichotomy presented. If the Muslim wants to posit that the commands from Allah is actually His will, therefore there is a moral relation presented as enactments or expressions through His commands, which are indexed to His nature as a means of grounding, they would still be burdened with expressing how this either A, doesn't fall into the first horn if they accept these moral facts exist in a relation state with His will as commands, or B, doesn't fall into the second horn, as it would ultimately reduce to his nature as grounding via his will's inseparability and expression of his nature. So this means there is no real way out of this binary, and the Muslims have no choice but to engage with the dichotomy presented. Premise 3 arises if it's the case they go down the first horn of that dichotomy presented in Premise 2. I won't spend too much time on this premise, considering it's pretty self-explanatory. Premise 3 is just positing that under the first horn of the dilemma, they fall victim to the Euthyphro dilemma. The Euthyphro dilemma, in short, is just asking if it's the case that X thing is good because God wills it to be, or is X thing good because God recognizes it as such and aligns his will with it. Simply, there is an issue with God merely stating something is good based on his whim, because it calls into question the arbitrary nature of morality and the implications of God's divine sovereignty and other metaphysical issues. On the other hand, God claiming something is good because he sees it as good suggests there exists an external source of goodness separate from his own nature and existence, making God's will dependent on an external higher source. Now, a Muslim could argue that Allah's commands of moral goodness are indexed to his nature. Rather, the commands are semantic expressions, or the commands are Allah's will. Therefore, they wouldn't be arbitrary. And they would actually be fine saying this. Premise 4 picks up on this refutation by introducing the second horn of the dilemma. This premise is simply setting up what will be a modus tollens structure. If Allah's commands express pre-existing moral facts grounded in his nature, the antecedent, then his nature must be consistent with the moral phenomena we recognize as well as scripture, the consequence. This is pretty straightforward, and shouldn't have much contention as it's a conditional statement that requires the next premise to substantiate its truth aptness. However, some Muslims might claim that these very assumptions here are false. They might claim that we are assuming that because Allah's nature is what the grounding of morality would be expressed as through the commands or will, then it should be evident that it corresponds with moral phenomena we recognize. They might follow up and claim that it isn't necessarily the case that these phenomena can be directly observed, therefore we can't assume we can have good reason to doubt Allah's nature would be consistent with the moral phenomena. There is an issue with this refutation, however. Firstly, when we say Allah's nature must be consistent with the moral phenomena we recognize, we are saying that there are features of reality, the moral properties, that should be corresponding with the revelations Allah gave us. Thus, if Allah were to say that stealing from babies is immoral, we would expect our epistemic accessibility, epistemic duties, axiological commitments to said duties, arising attitudes to said epistemic axiological system, and normative realist language used to refer to said system and attitudes to correspond with the moral truths as commanded by Allah. So, as presented next in Premise 5, if it were the case that these things do not correspond with Allah's moral content, then this would call into question the veracity of Allah's commands. Secondly, the moral phenomena we recognize as indexed to Allah's nature would also be applicable to the Quran. The reason being that the Quran is considered to be the literal, eternal, perfect word of Allah. Thus, there is a metaphysical commitment between the ontology of the Quran and Allah. Whether the ontology is distinct in some predicated manner, or there is no real distinction, as the word is not separate from Allah, it still serves as the epistemic source for recognizing the moral phenomena in reality via Allah's commands. So if there happens to be some contradiction within the very nature of Allah through the Quran, then it would not be the case, it would be consistent with the moral phenomena in reality, i.e. himself. Premise 5 is going to be quite a bit longer in explanation, so bear with me. The premise denies the consequence by claiming that it is not the case that Allah's moral contents and his commands are consistent with the moral phenomena that we recognize in reality along with scripture. Therefore, Allah's nature cannot be the grounding of moral truths as expressed in his commands, as in conclusion 1. So it's either that this allows the conclusions to necessarily follow, or we go back to square one, asserting that these commands would indicate arbitrary morality, which would just fall into the dilemma once more and allow the conclusions to necessarily follow. This premise is going to be the most contested along with premise 2, but I assure you it is also the easiest to defend. A Muslim is going to propose that it is not the case that Allah's moral content seemingly contradict moral phenomena in reality. We must be confused or applying some new modern secular form of morality in order to say that Allah's righteous commands are invalid, right? Well, it's certainly not that simple for the Islamist, in the least. Remember how I spoke about the lack of correspondence with moral phenomena also includes the Quran due to the metaphysical commitments Muslims make proposing the literal word of Allah? Well, it so happens that within the Quran, Allah actually causes a big mishap with the veracity of his commands. How does he do this? Well, Allah actually defers moral judgment and character to the Prophet Muhammad. In the Quran, we can see Allah do this in these surahs, showing that Muhammad is the moral exemplary as well as the moral judge and judge of character to align with. We can also see here in the Muwatta Malik Hadith 1643, Muhammad was sent to perfect moral character through his own, as established in the Quran. We even have tafsir, like those from Ibn Kathir, Ma'arif al-Quran, and Tazkir al-Quran. The tafsir also makes the same claim about Muhammad's perfect moral character, substantiating the claim that Allah views Muhammad as morally perfect, meaning Muhammad aligns with the moral grounding nature of Allah, hence why Allah defers moral judgments to Muhammad. In Ibn Kathir's tafsir, we even see him quoting Aisha and Sa'id bin Hisham's conversation, where Aisha explains that Muhammad's moral character was the Quran. So, we can actually view Muhammad's actions and judgments as being what corresponds with Allah's nature, especially given the fact Allah is all-knowing as mentioned in this list of surah. In an ironic sense, it's a sort of partnership Allah makes with Muhammad, and Muslims have no choice but to take Muhammad's character as being one and the same with Allah. So herein lies the problem for Islam. If Muhammad's actions or judgments contradict what Allah has commanded, or Muhammad's judgments themselves become arbitrary, then it causes major problems with Allah's omniscience and veracity of His commands, more than likely making them arbitrary as well. So Muslims either have to bite the bullet and accept the first horn of the dilemma, which will lead to conclusions following, or accept that Allah doesn't seem to have these properties the Quran affirms, such as omniscience, making Islam false. The Muslim might suppose that this is fine because there is no account of Muhammad contradicting any commands of Allah, nor contradicting himself. Well, unfortunately for them, I have plenty of material to go over. So let's start out first with the sore thumb of this dilemma: Muhammad's slaves and affirmation of slavery. Now, whether you're the type of Muslim who's thinking, there's no way the Prophet Muhammad would own slaves, or say it's morally permissible, or of course it's okay to own slaves, inshallah, what's the issue? But regardless of what side of the fence you fall on this claim, both will come to see why it is such a problem. You see, in Surah 2:177, it claims that an action such as freeing slaves is in fact the righteous or most righteous action a Muslim could take. So, if a person were to possess a great moral character, or dare I say, a moral exemplary, then you could expect them to free slaves whenever they had the capability to do so. Unfortunately, our friend Muhammad seemed to have skipped over that revelation from Allah and decided slaves were up for grabs. Here in these hadiths, starting with Sahih Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, Sunan Abi Dawud 2054, as well as Surah 424 and 3350, we see that Muhammad had slaves, sex slaves, and permitted slavery amongst fellow Muslims when they raided other communities. Do you see the problem here? Muhammad was granted the moral character of that of the likes of Allah, as well as Allah himself claiming that he is a moral judge and has moral perfection. Thus, Muhammad should logically be the most righteous amongst the men and perform righteous actions as Allah has commanded them. However, we see here that Muhammad has not done this. Has Allah had a lapse in knowledge claiming it was the case Muhammad was morally perfect and in his likeness as the moral criteria? It certainly seems that way. But what shouldn't be the case given that surah of many like 49:16 claiming Allah is perfect in knowledge, and verses like Surah 68:7 that claim Allah knows who is rightly guided with his perfect knowledge. There seems to be an apparent contradiction here. Allah in his perfect knowledge claims Muhammad is a moral perfection, criteria, and judge, yet Muhammad doesn't seem to heed his commands, making Muhammad an unrighteous person, or at the very least, not the most righteous. So as premise 5 stated, there doesn't seem to be consistency within Allah's nature to the moral phenomena we recognize in virtue of the contradictions of scripture in the Quran, which call into question Allah's ontology. It's either the case that Allah is in fact not all-knowing, or these moral commands are just arbitrarily applied, as seen in Muhammad's actions. To make matters worse, Muhammad himself is also seemingly arbitrary in his applications of moral judgments. As previously explained, This is an issue because Allah has deferred moral judgments and criteria to Muhammad because of Muhammad's moral character being like that of Allah. For example, we see here in Hadith Sunan Abi Dawud 2146, Muhammad gives a command not to beat the handmaids, until Umar came complaining to him about the women. Then Muhammad commanded it was permissible to beat them. Well, that was until many women came complaining to him about his change of command allowing the beatings to ensue, which women were not very happy with. He then claimed the men who did the beatings were not the best amongst you. Strange. He changed his judgment at what seems like it's at the drop of a dime. There doesn't seem to be any real application of these moral commands here that can be reflected to Muhammad's character as well as Allah's character, given they are morally perfect in their paradigm. Speaking of more beatings, in Sahih Bukhari 5825, Muhammad would also contradict the law, even granting the Muslims contemporary views, as Surah 434 would state, to only strike them lightly. However, Aisha states that the woman was green from the beatings and even questioned the safety of women under Islam. Muhammad does not address this in the slightest and actually admonishes the woman for her actions, which caused this to occur, showing the beatings was not only harsh, but that the moral character of Muhammad doesn't find that as an issue. Here again, we see Muhammad can't seem to make up his mind about moral judgments despite being a moral character like the Quran. We not only see contradictions in that hadith, but also other hadith like Sunan Abi Dawud 2144, where in regards to talking about the treatment of wives, he says, "Do not beat them." This again shows a lack of consistency within his moral framework, as he has permitted beatings and has not admonished those who beat their wives until they are green, yet he commands in other hadiths to not do the very thing he seems in support of. Ultimately, it seems Muhammad is not a consistent moral agent or judge, which calls into question Allah's ontology, as this would have major implications for the lack of veracity in the Quran's claims. Up until now, I have been speaking about one aspect of moral phenomena, that being Allah's nature as corresponding with the Quran. The other aspect would be the moral properties and normative features of reality we recognize via our epistemic accessibility. This will be shorter in explanation, as I feel the contradictions within Islamic framework dealing with Muhammad and moral commands was more conducive overall for substantiating the argument. For all intensive purposes, I will just deal with the general moral realist framework, more aligned with naturalism, considering Islam posits objective morality. If a Muslim feels there is a meta-ethical framework that would bring a good objection to this aspect, then feel free to demonstrate. This subject is actually something Muhammad stays consistent in with following Allah's commands. Unfortunately, it's the worst subject within Islam, and that's saying something. In Surah 65:4, we see Allah gives instructions for how to marry women after a divorce, in which He gives a waiting period. In this surah, it says, "And those who have not menstruated," meaning young girls. Not only have they not hit puberty yet, but they were in a marriage that has been consummated, i.e., these young girls have had sex and will be married again for sex, all before hitting puberty. This is backed up by tafsir from Ibn Abbas and Ibn Kathir, claiming this did in fact mean it was directed at young girls prior to puberty. Muhammad is also seen marrying the notorious Aisha at 6 years old and consummating the marriage at 9, most likely prior to puberty, as seen in these hadiths from Sahih Bukhari and this hadith in Sunan Abi Dawud 4933. So it seems pretty clear-cut that Allah allows for a marriage of young girls prior to puberty. The issue is that we can see from the data that this is harmful in pretty much every aspect for the young girls. To start, a girl's first period does not indicate physical maturity. Puberty is a steady process that requires time for the body to fully acclimate to safely bearing children, as mentioned in Kaban's work of Physiology, Puberty 2022. In an epidemiological study of child marriage in rural community of Kufarat, it indicates that child marriage was significantly associated with issues such as delayed antenatal care, spontaneous abortion, preterm delivery, low birth weight, health problems in the newborn, incorrect feeding practices, and so on. The study also highlights child mothers not being physiologically nor psychologically prepared for childbirth. Girls under 15 years of age are also around 5 times more likely to die during pregnancy and childbirth than a 20-year-old, according to the United Nations Children Fund. Young girls becoming child mothers also suffer from psychological issues during pregnancy and childbirth, as reported by multiple studies, which speak about these girls having higher depression rates, suicidal rates, stunted social development, and so forth. Along with these empirical justifications of obvious harm, there's also an issue with young girls' reason-based faculties not being adequately enough to genuinely consent, which would call into the question of the capability to not do harm every time they engage in sexual activity under Islamic rule. It seems that all these features of reality as observed don't seem to correspond with the law's nature being the grounding of moral phenomena, considering the normative aspects don't match. Even moral anti-realists by large majority will concede that these sort of normative affairs would be against our preferences and interests. Truly, it seems that Allah has failed to meet due with the moral world. So as explained in the video, it appears that the Quran and Muhammad have a multitude of contradictions, and issues arise now when looking at Allah's nature in that aspect. Allah's nature also fails to align with the moral phenomenon in reality, calling into question if He is the source of objective morals. Ultimately, concluding that Allah fails to meet the criteria for being the grounding for objective morality, we can also conclude that Islam's account of morality is incoherent. Thanks for watching the video. Be sure to share with friends and family, and until next time, God bless.